Do the Bills have any trade candidates on their roster? I'm going to examine the offensive positions to find the most likely options today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Wednesday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, or if you're joining us on the YouTube channel, your first watch every day. Well, today and tomorrow on the podcast, we are going to examine the Buffalo Bills roster and see if there are any trade candidates. And for today, I'm going to focus on the offensive side of the football. Tomorrow, I'm going to focus on the defensive side of the football. And so I've even joked about this at times where Brandon Beane doesn't really subscribe to the compensatory pick formula where you have to have this net negative when it comes to departures in free agency compared to what you bring in through free agency. And his comp picks are really just trading players that aren't going to make his roster to other teams. And Brandon Beane has a long history of trading players and acquiring draft picks. And so to start things off today, and because this is the offensive side of football, I want to look back at some of those trades that he made with offensive players. Tomorrow we will look at the defensive trades and then, of course, do the defensive positions. But today's about offense. And so I want to start with a reflection on the players he's shipped off for draft capital, or in some cases for a player in some draft capital, and then look at this year's roster and see if we can figure out which players could be on the move this summer. So real quick, let's start with his trade history. These are all trades that he did as GM of the Buffalo Bills. In 2017, he sent quarterback Cardale Jones to the Chargers for a 7th-round pick. And one other note here, all of the trades that I'm going to mention are an example of where the Bills sent a player for a pick, not the other way around. So he sent a player on the roster for a pick. Cardale Jones to the Chargers for a 7th-round pick. Wide receiver Sammy Watkins and a 6th-round pick to the Rams for cornerback E.J. Gaines and a 2nd-round pick. In 2018, quarterback Tyrod Taylor to the Browns for a 3rd-round pick. Offensive tackle Cordy Glenn and pick 21 in the draft, and pick 158, So Cordy Glenn, 21 and 158 to the Bengals for pick 12 and 187. And obviously we know that that deal was the catalyst for the Bills getting into striking range to trade up for Josh Allen. Brandon Beane also traded quarterback A.J. McCarron to the Raiders for a 5th-round pick. Offensive tackle Marshall Newhouse to the Panthers for a 7th-round pick. None of this stings at all, does it? Are you disappointed in any of these players yet? No, those are good trades. 2019, wide receiver Zay Jones to the Raiders for a 5th-round pick. Now, that was in season. 2020, offensive lineman Russell Bodine to the Patriots for a 6th-round pick. Now, this one stings a little. Interior offensive lineman Wyatt Teller to the Browns for a 5th-round pick and a 6th-round pick. And then most recently, in 2021, tight end Lee Smith to the Falcons for a 7th-round pick. And so that's a nice little inventory of examples of players being sent away and was able to get some draft capital back in exchange for guys that really there wasn't a plan for them to stick around. And we'll do the same thing tomorrow when it comes to defense. So let's go position by position and look at what player at each position would be the most likely trade candidate. And we'll start with quarterback, where the Bills have Josh Allen, Case Keenum, and Matt Barkley. Now, one thing that I'm going to do here, is I'm going to force myself to pick at least one player from every position group. And so let me start with a little disclaimer when it comes to the quarterbacks, and that I think it's very unlikely that any of these three quarterbacks are traded. Obviously not Josh Allen. And as for Matt Barkley, I don't think there's any trade value for Matt Barkley. This guy bounced around on 3 different practice squads last year. Nobody's given up anything to get Matt Barkley. So the player that would have the greatest chance would be Case Keenum when it comes to the quarterbacks. And I would find it to be highly unlikely if this were the case, but if a team's starter went down, he could be in play. I mean, Case Keenum did that whole thing in Minnesota where they had a couple of quarterbacks go down and led them to the playoffs and had a really good season. Parlayed that into the opportunity in Denver. Won a couple games for the Browns last year. So if I'm forcing myself to pick a player at every position, it's Case Keenum, but I find it to be highly unlikely because obviously the Bills value the quarterback, the backup quarterback position, and they targeted Case Keenum, a player they traded for, to be Josh Allen's backup. So based on the available options, I'm going with Case Keenum, but I don't think you're going to see any movement here with shipping off any of these players. If anything, the Bills will add another arm to help them get through camp in, the preseason. So very unlikely, which will not be the case for other positions. I think that there's some good conversations to be had, but we start with quarterback and we start with a boring answer. But you know what's not boring? Built Bar. These things are phenomenal. The best tasting protein bars on the planet. They're delicious. They're healthy. And they have tons of great flavors. They're covered in 100% real chocolate, and it doesn't make sense how good they are, but they are absolutely delicious, and they're good for you. They're low calorie, low sugar. They're high in protein. The macros are just off the charts, and it's not just the Built Bars. They've got the Puffs, which is really my favorite. I like Puffs the most, to be completely honest with you. It's a protein-infused marshmallow covered in chocolate. It's delicious, and I'm not even a marshmallow guy. The granola bars are phenomenal. I love them as well. And especially love they have this white chocolate berry that's just phenomenal. I love them. They're covered in 100% chocolate as well. And love snacking on them. Love sometimes having them for breakfast as my actual breakfast. They are really, really good, really healthy for you. Covered in 100% chocolate. Tons of great flavors and tons of great health benefits. Got a deal for you if you want to try Built Bars. Go to Built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15. You'll get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. The next position group that I want to get into is running back, where the Bills have Devin Singletary and James Cook, Zach Moss, Duke Johnson, Tywan Jones, Raheem Blackshear, and Reggie Gilliam as the fullback tight end hybrid player. The name that really pops here for me is Zach Moss, a player that, the Bills took in the 3rd round a couple of years ago and hasn't found much of an impact yet. And, he was a good player at Utah. He was a good prospect, but injuries were a problem for him in college. And they've been a problem for him so far in the NFL. And I think Zach Moss is a more talented football player than he's demonstrated so far in Buffalo. But the bottom line is he hasn't been effective. And when I survey this landscape on the Bills depth chart of running backs, he's the name that pops to me. Maybe you can mention Duke Johnson, but I'm not sure there's a lot of value out there for a guy like Duke Johnson, who basically wasn't on a roster at all last year until the Dolphins were so desperate they needed a running back. They brought him in and he made a little bit of an impact, but the NFL kind of moved on from Duke Johnson last year. So the guy that I think would represent the most intrigue for teams that you could think would be available is Zach Moss. And part of me is a little bit excited for Zach Moss because he's actually healthy, and that hasn't been the case for the last couple of off seasons. And as a rookie, there was a lot of buzz, right? A lot of really positive remarks from the Bills beat reporters about Zach Moss during camp, but he got injured right away with the turf toe. So that really put him behind as a rookie. So like I said, I think Zach Moss is a better football player than we've seen. And maybe that could entice a team to go back to their scouting report on him and say, yeah, let's give him a fresh opportunity to come to our place and send the Bills a late day 3 pick. And I think part of that stems from the health of the existing players, right? You're not going to send off Zach Moss if you're not comfortable with the health of what's in front of him. And of course, that you're satisfied with rostering Duke Johnson as your third running back. So I think there's a reasonable chance here at running back. I'm not going to sit here and say it's likely or anything like that, but Zach Moss could have some appeal from other teams, and the Bills could be willing to move on from him based on what Duke Johnson has demonstrated, the growth of Devin Singletary, and of course, the second-round pick, James Cook. So I think there's a better conversation to be had here at running back than we had at quarterback, but at the end of the day, it still probably won't happen. The NFL typically doesn't love running backs, right, in terms of investing assets to trade to get them back. And the Bills would definitely have to kind of take an L here, right? A former third-round pick that you're probably going to flip for something later on. So a little bit complicated, but I think there's a better chance here than at quarterback. Let's move on to the wide receiver position. The Bills got a lot of wide receivers. Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Jamison Crowder, Khalil Shakir, Jake Kumaro, Isaiah McKenzie, Tavon Austin, Marquez Stevenson, Isaiah Hodgins. Those are the players that I would at least bring to the table. You know, I didn't mention Tanner Gentry, other bottom of the depth chart type players like that. The name that pops for me here is Marquez Stevenson. Day 3 pick last year, injured early on, made that big long touchdown catch in the preseason. Had some decent moments as a returner, but ultimately fell out of favor there. I'm just trying to look at these position groups and find a guy that has some level of value that I think would be interesting to other teams. And Stevenson is a guy that has some big play potential. You could see him being the one that there's the most intrigue for. And especially if you feel really good about, or you really want to keep both Tavon Austin and Isaiah McKenzie, then Marquez Stevenson just becomes extremely redundant with this group. So he's the name that pops for me. I think Isaiah Hodgins is worth mentioning, although there's nothing really to go off. He hasn't done anything yet in the NFL. But if a team wants a tall, long receiver that has good hands, that had a good career at Oregon State, that feels like he's been kind of just buried in Buffalo, maybe there's some appeal there. But Marquez Stevenson feels like the leader in the clubhouse to me. And look, maybe you're thinking about Tavon Austin. Well, Tavon Austin was signed in June, and so if teams wanted Tavon Austin, they would have signed him already, right? And then just the last couple of years, Tavon Austin's been a guy that hasn't signed a contract with a team until very late in the offseason, even later, like July, kind of a training camp signing. So I just wonder what the value is out there for a guy like Tavon Austin. So Marquez Stevenson, my pick at wide receiver. At tight end, this is an interesting conversation to have. You've got Dawson Knox, O.J. Howard, Tommy Sweeney, Jalen Weidermeyer, the UDFA out of Texas A&M, and Quentin Morris, the UDFA last year out of Bowling Green. Now, Dawson Knox, O.J. Howard, both in contract years. I think the Bills are excited about that pair, and I am too. I don't think either of those guys are going anywhere. I think they want to see what they can do, what they can tinker around with a couple of really talented tight ends. So the name that pops here for me is actually Tommy Sweeney. And not that I think Tommy Sweeney is a slam dunk trade candidate, but when I try to explore a path for one of these tight ends, there's at least an avenue here that makes sense to me with Tommy Sweeney. And that's with the New York Giants, where Joe Shane, former Bills assistant GM, is their GM, was part of the front office that drafted Tommy Sweeney. Of course, Brian Dable, the Bills' former offensive coordinator, now their head coach. Bobby Johnson's there. Shea Tierney's there. There's a lot of people that have spent a lot of time around Tommy Sweeney. And Tommy Sweeney, maybe he hasn't made an impact on the field, but you get the sense that he's a great guy for the locker room, a great guy to just be as part of your team. Is going to practice hard, that his teammates are going to respect. And when you're a new regime like Dable and Shane in New York, where you need to make an impression on a franchise and you need to get buy-in from the locker room, having a familiar face like a Tommy Sweeney who bought in Buffalo might not be a bad idea. So there's that component of the conversation where it just kind of makes sense for them to add a player that can help connect the message to the locker room. But also, the Giants' tight end situation is terrible. Their projected starter right now is Daniel Bellinger, a 4th-round pick. They got Ricky Seals-Jones, who's kind of a receiver converting to tight end. Jordan Akins, who hasn't done a thing in the NFL after, kind of going to Houston. And then bottom feeders, guys that aren't rosterable. So not only is there a logical component here just based on the ties, but also, my goodness, the Giants need something at tight end. There's a path for him to make the roster. Now, let's face it, the Bills only dressed one tight end last year. Down the stretch after that Panthers game, it was just Dawson Knox. And so, while he might be a great teammate and the Bills might want to keep him around to be the tight end 3, there could be other options that they could explore here. Now, I don't know that there's other options. I don't think there's another team out there that would trade for Tommy Sweeney. But that could be a logical match. Let's move on to the offensive line. And this is a spot where Brandon Beane has found a lot of partners with trading away offensive linemen, whether that's Cordy Glenn, Marshall Newhouse, Russell Bodine, Wyatt Teller. Brandon Beane has built very, very deep offensive lines with experienced players. And you can't keep them all, right? You can roster 9, maybe 10, stash a couple on the practice squad. But even the way that this is constructed, the Bills are looking at a surplus of offensive linemen, and that's a good problem to have. And obviously, injuries could change a lot. But when I look at this group of Deion Dawkins, Roger Saffold, Mitch Morse, Ryan Bates, Spencer Brown, David Quessenberry, Tommy Doyle, Ike Bucker, Greg Manns, Cody Ford, Greg Van Roten, Bobby Hart, Luke Tenuta. I think we got several options here. I think there's 3 reasonable options that I think the Bills could look to trade. And predictively, I would say this is probably the most likely. 3 names pop to me. Greg Manns, Cody Ford, and Greg Van Roten. Start with Greg Manns, who was actually traded last year. He was on the Ravens, and the Ravens sent him and a 7th-round pick to the Dolphins for a 6th-round pick. Versatile interior player that started games in the league. This is what you want in your backup interior offensive lineman. Now, I think the Bills' appetite to move on from Greg Manns would really be tied to Ike Bucker and his recovery, because I think they like to have a nice bullpen of guys that you feel comfortable with playing some center for you. But I think he's a very logical name to bring up. I think Greg Van Roten's a very logical name to bring up, who started 50 games over the last 4 seasons in the NFL. Again, a guy that was available in June, and certainly if he had a whole lot of value out there, somebody would have signed him a lot sooner, but injuries happen, things change. The Bills found a partner for Russell Bodine and a partner for Marshall Newhouse. You're telling me that some things couldn't go the right way and Greg Van Roten be a trade candidate? And then the last one is Cody Ford, and Cody Ford could be really interesting. A lot of the stuff that I said about Zach Moss is true about Cody Ford. And Cody Ford's a talented football player. He was a top 40 pick for a reason. Mock draft a lot of times in the first round. He's a skilled football player. Just hadn't been very effective for the Bills, and I think that there's some circumstances that have prevented him from really blossoming in Buffalo, whether that's been his own injuries, whether that's been switching positions. He's had some personal matters that have come up. Now, I think that the organization is pretty excited about what he can be this year with a kind of a fresh start. He's healthy for the first time in the offseason. Aaron Cromer. But this could be your guy that you actually get something for. You know, if teams think to themselves, wow, yeah, some of those dynamics were difficult for him. We go back to our scouting report, and he's worth a flyer for a guy that's kind of entering a contract year. You bring him in, see what you can get out of him, and have kind of an opportunity to, I guess, interview him for a year, right, before you make a commitment to him where he's actually going to play. I don't know that we're going to learn anything new about Cody Ford this year because I'm not sure he's going to play. He might get better, but we'll never know. And so there could be just a lot of just mutual understanding of this being the best thing for him, especially if you feel good about your depth with a Greg Mans and a Greg Van Roten as, your interior backups, and even Tommy Toyle getting some opportunities to play on the interior based on the OTAs. So maybe Cody Ford's a guy that there's a logical conversation to have there. But I think there's three reasonable options in Greg Mans, Cody Ford, and Greg Van Roten. I don't think Bobby Hart has any value, but I'll toss his name in there as a guy who started a ton of games in the NFL. But I think the Bills are in pretty good shape with their interior or their overall offensive line depth, and that opens the opportunity for a few names to be brought to the table here. And looking throughout Brandon Beane's history, it's very, very logical. And so the names that I think are most likely at each position: quarterback Case Keenum, running back Zach Moss, wide receiver Marquez Stevenson, tight end Tommy Sweeney, kind of with that caveat being the Giants, and then three offensive linemen: Greg Mans, Cody Ford, Greg Van Roten. Now, there's a chance that none of this will happen, right? But based on history, there's a reasonable chance, and I think surveying the roster for some candidates makes sense for us to do here in early July. Hope you enjoyed this. Tomorrow, we will turn our attention to the defensive side of the football and have a very similar conversation, but through the lens of the defensive depth chart. So come on back. Make sure that you're subscribed. We'd love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.